Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This is the Career and Future panel. We have here three different panelists who are going to speak to this. I think specifically in a time of rising inflation, or reconsidering the traditional 9-to-5 and really understanding the new landscape of our professional lives and what that really means for us as we move forward. It's very exciting to have these three people to come and speak to us and hopefully give us some advice as we are entering our careers, whether you are an alum or you are a current student. Hopefully you'll get some great tidbits from here. So I just want to start off with each of our panelists giving a quick introduction about them, talking a little bit more about their own career path, and we'll go from there. If you'd like to start.
Okay. I'm Dr. Mandeep Rai. I'm an LSE alum. Very proud to say that. Woo! Woo! Yes. And I hope many of you are too. I believe most of you, if not all of you. Hands up if you aren't. So maybe a third or a half. That's really interesting. It's great that you're here, even though you're not. So welcome. And I want to give a quick shout out to Ken and Elise and others, because a lot of effort has been put into doing this. And even though half of us are LSE alum, we didn't do it, right? So that's something to just kudos, and we're grateful. Yes, so I came here to study international relations. I basically have a international development background, worked in venture capital and journalism. And then the last 10 years have basically done a deep dive into values and created this book called The Values Compass. It takes you to 101 different countries and helps you figure out your purpose, life, and leadership based on your values. And I think that's why I'm on this panel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. I'm an outsider. I've never attended LSE, but I am an American transplant that went to Cambridge and is maybe eventually going to finish her PhD at Oxford, where I study politics and psychology as a doctoral student. I'm also somebody who has worked for a long time with an organization called the School of Life, and I think the reason I'm here is that I have been slowly guiding them towards finishing a white paper that we actually began right before the pandemic hit. And this white paper is about the role of employees' sense of autonomy in the workforce and how increasingly people are working as independent contractors and freelancers, and that is due not just to need, but also to desire, that people really desire a sense of autonomy in work. And our white paper is a guide for employers, especially, although everyone, to think about what this really means and how you can make that possible in your workplace. So we're going to release this white paper soon, and I've just been looking at more data on it. It's very interesting to me as somebody who studies psychology to see what a deep impact that's had on our own literal economy, this one psychological need.
Okay, I have no idea why I'm here compared to these two. I don't have a book. I haven't done any research. I did my postgrad here about a couple of decades ago. I am a dinosaur, hence my short arms. I went through, I did lots of classic sort of LSE grad, bad life choices, worked in consulting, bad life choice, then ended up doing sort of working in a large corporate, large media organization, trying to change it, trying to fix journalism, could not do it. Still broken, will be broken for many years. I had a couple of entrepreneurial journeys, bits on the way, got to be the first product guy at a small UK startup that sold to Cisco. Which is in the 2000s, which I realized, for those who don't, Cisco is like a large American networking company. I realized, not really people know that. Then I built my own talent tech company, where we tried to basically use machine learning to better identify biases in hiring. And we sold that to TopTal, which is now the product is TopTal Finance. And then I became a venture capitalist. So I've been a partner at 500 Startups, which is one of the world's most global and active investors. I've worked in 18 different countries because, shockingly, talent is distributed, but opportunity isn't. And I'm carrying on that same adventure at Techstars, where I'm the managing director there for the London entity. We're actually on campus. We're in Aldwych House. If you want to come by and talk early stage stuff. But yeah, I know about early stage startups and bad life choices, so I have zero right to play here. I think I am, and I think this is awesome, the diversity male panelist. Yeah!
All right, thank you all so much, and I wouldn't discredit yourself. You are here for a very good reason, and I think your advice will be really valuable for everyone here. But I think just to kick off, I think it's really important to start off with when we're talking about younger generations, specifically millennials and Gen Z who are going into the workforce and are really just starting their careers. We talk a lot about this mindset shift and this value shift that's occurred between our generations and those before us who didn't really grow up with technology. You know, millennials were the digital natives who grew up as the internet was growing up. So I think one thing I would love to know from Mandeep specifically is, specifically through your research and having gone to 101 nations for your book, what was something that you saw collectively, like among millennials and younger people? Like, is there really like an inherent shared value that you think, like, it makes us distinct against the other generations?
Yes, in short.
Yeah.
I've now been to 185 countries, 20 left, I think. Depends, which census, where we're looking, but essentially. And there is a distinct difference between the generations. I think, to your point, younger people are basically much more driven by their values. And employers often say they're very entitled. It seems like we find it really hard to handle these millennials. They talk about mental health being really important, which of course it is important, but I think they're finding that they are being challenged by millennials. When actually I think the truth is the fact that maybe there's just a little bit of a misunderstanding. Like the baby boomers before us had a job for life. And now, if you're practically don't have your own startup by the age of 30, you're kind of wondering what you're doing in life and why, how have you failed? So generally, I remember going back to my business school reunion. It was the 5th year reunion, and people were like, you're not onto your next job yet? Like, if you're not changing every 2-3 years, you were questioning yourself. And if you weren't building a portfolio career, you were questioning yourself. So I think through all of our careers, you've already heard a ton of changes. And that just wasn't the case before. And then if you think about the generation after, Gen Z, etc., there's this sense of wanting to be autonomous beyond even, I think, what we recognize. So it's not just about being a freelancer or being a consultant or being independent. It's about being really understood and heard and valued. And actually, the pandemic has been really, 1, terrible, and 2, good. Terrible in the sense that a lot of people didn't get a chance necessarily to be heard or to be appreciated or understood. You weren't onboarded with at the cooler, you didn't have a chance to really interact with your team in the same way. But good in the way that it became really transparent. And the leaders that really have flown and the leaders that stood out are those leaders that have made a specific effort to make sure that each and every person in the team really is heard and understood. And actually, I think those leaders that have stood out that are those that look after the younger generation specifically, and are looking at things like the 4-day work week or working even less hours in order to increase well-being and productivity, and just being mindful of what people need rather than what they think needs to be done.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think empathy is really one of those things that people in millennial Gen Z generations are really looking for from their employer. So.
Yeah, and it's a value that, it goes both ways. It's like we talk about respect being earned, but you have to both give respect and earn respect, and it's the same with empathy, it's the same with compassion. So I think once these values are in place, the next generation definitely feel like, okay, we want to work here. They feel as though it's not good enough just to work because you have a job. They want to contribute, have a purpose, have a mission, and be doing something really meaningful in their lives. Right. So that's where the difference is.
Yeah. And Sarah, do you think that, finding that meaning is why autonomy is so important for these generations?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. So we've had a lot of research on autonomy in the workplace starting a really long time ago. One of my absolute favorite ones is what's called the Whitehall study, where they looked at employees at every level of employment in the civil service, and they tracked their everything about their health, so what kind of diagnoses had their doctors given them over years and years, their diet, how much exercise they got, etc. And what they found that was surprising is that if you took two people who had basically the same statistics otherwise about their health, it really mattered in terms of how likely they were to die early or have a stroke, for example, whether they had a bit of autonomy about how they dealt with crises at work. So somebody higher up who got to make the call about what are we going to do now did much better in terms of living a long life and generally sleeping better and all these other things than someone who was, maybe paid reasonably well compared to that person, but didn't get to make the call. So that was one of the first bits of research, which I think is very intriguing about just how important it is to be able to make certain calls about your own life and the things you're doing at work. But since then, we've had much, much, much more research on this. And the most recent bit of research that we have on autonomy that is really telling is that people are choosing, and I really mean choosing here, to work as independent contractors and freelancers, even when they have other options that are equally well paid and in some ways equally prestigious. Now, this isn't just a sort of random, out of nowhere psychological need in the same way that, I don't know, our interest in sex is or something, right? It's very materially based. It's partially that employees have correctly noticed that even if they're given a 9-to-5 job that seems stable, the world is on fire, and that job may not exist in a year or two. So if you think about it, almost every source of employment we've ever had is a trade-off between autonomy and stability. And if an employer offers an employee a good enough sense of security for their life, that they can, okay, now you can have a mortgage and a family and do this and do that, they might make the trade-off. They might say, yes, okay, fine, I'll give up loads of autonomy. I'll literally get up and commute for an hour and a half in order to have this kind of stability. But today, many employees, especially very young employees, have never seen a world where that seems possible. And even if they're offered something that looks like it, they are correctly very, very suspicious of it. So they probably always had a drive towards some autonomy, but they are much less willing to make the trade-off for stability now. And especially when we look at data in America, Britain's been a bit weird in the last few years, but although it's not, yeah, in many ways, but also specifically in the autonomy freelance work data, both countries have seen a massive rise in chosen freelancing, part-time, self-employment, etc. But America especially, even since the pandemic has hit, increasingly people say, I work for myself, I choose it this way, I could do something else, but I chose this because I want to be my own boss and to control my own hours, and I think it's better for my health. And I think that this is something that, if you look at the way large organizations especially work, employers are just not prepared for. So I think, to go back to your original question, now that I've introduced the research, it does have to do with meaning. We've actually created a cute little graph in our white paper about this, where one aspect of autonomy is meaning, in particular feeling that you understand why your work matters and you agree with it. And the other one just has to do with actually an interesting thing about sort of competence. If we think about autonomy as the ability to actually go and do the thing you're being asked to do and to know how to do it and to be constantly maybe expanding your skill set in that area. And I think employers miss that aspect a lot as well. So I think the youngest generation probably has a great drive for both of those things, and it's probably tied into many of the meanings in your values, rather, in your book.
May I ask, out of this whole room, how many people work for themselves? Contractors, freelancers? Yeah, so at least 50%. Yeah, at least
That's
50%.
huge.
Yeah.
That wasn't true 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. Actually, so Salim, I'm very curious because you work directly with these early stage startups and you're working with arguably like the future leaders, right, of our world. So what are the characteristics that you find are really common among these people, specifically the ones that you do choose to work with?
So heads up, I'm a bit unusual to most VCs. My current batch is 96% female, minority or immigrant, 67% are female, and being blunt, I find a lot of what's being said here just a bit, I think it's great if you have the optionality, genuinely. Because the sad truth and reality is when you look at aggregate data, a large amount of people do have optionality. They have the optionality to choose which job, which career they want to go to. They have a choice of offers from different firms. They have this stuff. And so being blunt, I don't know about the people that have the optionality, being blunt. Because I've actively found that they don't make good investments. So shock horror, I have a diversity policy in my thing, and it's about white public school boys. And I interview every single one. I mean, I do have white public school friends, I just want to be clear. I don't hate them, right? But they don't do well in our selection process, and so I need to work out why. But they generally have more optionality. And people with social, it's not just, it's social class, it's a mixture of things, so being clear. And so to the people that I speak to, optionality just doesn't really, that's what many drives many to entrepreneurship and equally independent work. It's the idea of they may get a job offer, they may have this, that and the other, but it may not be quite what they're looking for. And often their idea of how do I find a world that suits me, that works with me and embraces me, is often the case why they often go and create companies themselves. But I genuinely believe it's actually more to do with optionality that's driving it, rather than freedom desire. It's a very nice way of glossing it, and maybe it's because my worldview is skewed. Being clear, right? I was in a world where it was 4 times harder for me to get into the same university, much like Rishi Sunak. Because as we know, it turns out in this country, if you happen to be a white woman who can just talk nonsense, versus a very qualified, very capable person, the optionality goes to the one with the social privilege, right? Am I wrong? I mean, am I wrong? I mean, you look at the stuff. So, I mean, unfortunately, that's just representative of the world we live in. So, I think there's an element things are different and harder. And being clear, I remember my friends applying for jobs. Thankfully it's different now. But 2 decades ago, I ended up doing 30 applications. Many of my other peers would do 3 or 4 and just walk in. Maybe I'm just not that bright. I get it. I'm not that bright. I'm not that accomplished. But point being is that the world does not give everybody the same optionality. And I actually think it's the optionality and the lack thereof which drives people to go ahead and be these characters. But what's really awesome about these characters is they want to build a world and environments that resonate with a different set of people. Because the one thing people forget, people think startups are all about, here's a market, let me go build, I've got this great idea. It's not. It's all about the team. It's all about the people. It's all about the camaraderie. When you speak to people who aren't as privileged as we are, almost everybody here has an advanced degree from top Global 100 university, right? We have choice, right? In ways that others people don't. The vast majority of people stay in their jobs because they like the people and they feel like they're treated well. And those are the lead indicators. So to what are these entrepreneurial leaders? What do we encourage them to do? Build amazing teams. Find your tribe. Hire people within your tribe. Because what's really interesting is because you yourself didn't belong and couldn't belong to the corporate world or the corporate structures you were supposed to go into from your very fancy educations. Build the worlds for them. And that's what the best startups do. But that said, it's not actually all about shorter work weeks. It's not about fewer hours or remote working or flexible working. It comes much more down to culture. And I can expand for a while, but I don't want to hold the stage.
No, I think what you said is very interesting, and optionality is obviously a massive part of it, and it's not lost on us that most of us, if we have not gone to the workforce, will very likely go into white-collar work, and we'll probably be making a substantial salary compared to other people in developing nations, specifically in the global south. We have these opportunities, and we might be more in the place to start these ventures than people who do come from these nations or these communities.
But let me be clear: not everybody in this room, optionality in this room is not evenly distributed, even though everybody's graduating with similar degrees. So just let's not just assume. Make a wild assumption like the government often does.
No, absolutely. And I think from here, it would be really good to shift kind of into where we're going. What industries are really going to emerge, and what's going to be disrupted as we take this mindset shift into the workplace, especially as Gen Z's really now just entering it. So one thing I would really like to know, kind of shifting gears to, is Salim, I'm wondering if there's any specific industries that you find, I know we talk a lot about Web3 and the metaverse disrupting the modern workplace, and these are things I love, but I'm really curious if those are things that we really should consider, or if they really are as disruptive in your experience working with these emerging companies.
I think Web3 and the metaverse has a huge role to play in changing the way that we engage, dynamic, and trade, in particular, more so in the Web3. But there is no substitute for human connection, ever. Community is community, whether it's online, in person, or whatever. Relationships are relationships, whether they're online or in person. But there will always be a primacy and a basic human need for in-person connection. And how that's satisfied will be the challenge. Will be the big challenge of the next generation. And I think for many people's individual social circles may not be broad or diverse enough.
Yeah.
For many people, one of the joys of work is that it expands your world, your network, your identity, right? It is quite depressing. And you said you went to Cambridge, right? Right, so I imagine most of your friends from your college still hang out with your friends from their colleges.
Especially in Britain. It's amazing because they never leave the island. So they don't even get to go to like California. They're all together. Yeah.
I mean, and they laughed at me when I moved to California after graduation. Anyway,
Yeah, it's a small island.
and this is the thing. I mean, this is like this whole world, and it's quite homogenic, and that's one of the things. Like, and then it isn't enough for many people, I don't think. So that's how I see that piece of the challenge. But I think you guys are interesting to join in.
Yeah, I mean, no, I would love to hear more from both of you about this.
Well, I was just going to say to the point that we were building on yesterday, even communities that, let's say now, digital nomads. Last week I was with the G20 in Indonesia, in Bali actually. And Bali is definitely a place that is a magnet for these digital nomads. But they don't just go all over Bali. No, they go to Canggu or like one or two places, and then they all create a little community there. And it really doesn't, I'm not saying it doesn't matter whether they're there or in Brixton, it does. But the fact is that this need for community is real, it's legitimate, and I completely understand it. And yes, to your point about a lack of diversity, we do hang out with the people that we feel most comfortable with. And I'm not sure that whether we can force, well, I guess the workplace did force that to change. But, so for example, I have a BBC background. And I remember even the head of diversity wanting to leave because of the lack of diversity, ultimately. And this is, and she did. And this is because, we're in the world service. There couldn't be more diversity. But actually, right at the top, there was always a lack of diversity. And so there's a sense of, I think DEI is bandied around way too much, that we think that we're getting closer, we think that we're doing, that we're making changes in our organizations, but actually the way everything works, you can see, I mean, even just the racist slurs since Rishi has come into power to show you everything. Not that we were ever under any illusion that didn't exist, but it shows you a lot. Or, there's so much regarding DEI that I could go on and on and on. But yeah, still, even though there is that undertone, I'm very glad, however it's happened, that we do have a chance that the top job is with an ethnic minority. Is quite incredible. And I feel as though just in that happening, we're in a slightly different Britain. I feel it. And I remember when Brexit took place 7 years ago, I felt as though the colour of Britain had just changed in that one moment. So, yeah, I think it's a moment of celebration just for the fact that it happened.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I haven't got anything especially intelligent to say about Web3.
Yeah.
So I won't bullshit. But I agree with these points generally that I think firstly it's important to notice that what autonomy looks like is really different, and the drivers for it are going to be different depending on where you are. Yeah. And it might indeed be because you just don't want to be with the same kind of people anymore that or the people you've been stuck working with because you don't feel like you resonate with them or share values with them, or that they really give you options or that they respect you, right? That's a very serious limitation on your life. And it's true that almost all data on why people leave jobs is about their team, specifically their manager, but also their team. So that's huge. And I will also say, as a transplant, admittedly from another sort of wealthy white country, it is true that working cultures are very different, even between these two countries that I come from and now that I live in. And I wonder if one of the things that we could point to on the more human side is that we are going to be looking for people who can at least manage, if not actively bridge, those rather deep cultural divides. So a very basic example is that British people, in my experience working with them, will not tell you when you have done things poorly. And and it's really...
They will, but subtly.
Well, they will, but if you're an American, you've missed. Very interesting is an insult, in fact. And so, and I'm sure there are much vaster cultural divides that need bridging, right? Whereas Americans will say, yes, okay, but I think you're wrong, right? And then the British person will never work with you again because that's incredibly rude. So yeah, I think there's something to be said as well about a sort of shift in what skills are needed. It's not that you necessarily need to fit in, it's that you need to be able to kind of notice and switch modes. I noticed this also dealing with like my Dutch clients and my German clients who are very happy to tell me when I'm wrong. So.
We should have gone to the LSE instead of Oxford for your postgrad, because you'd been surrounded by a whole bunch of cultures. I mean, being blunt, that was probably one of the best bits of value I got from my masters here, like learning to deal with the myriad of cultures and adjust and adapt how I speak as a pretentious British person to Americans and to people from all over the world. But yes, mostly Americans and Chinese.
Yeah, well, I've done it through work now.
Well, I'm not. It's statistically correct, right? The public statistics, right?
Yeah.
Those are the two large groups, the LSE and postgrad. Anyway.
Yeah. No, I did it through work, so I met all my Germans and Chinese and Dutch, and I learned after university. It's true, and I think that's an interesting challenge to this. Like, I think we love to moralize about diversity, and that's really dull. Of course, it's true. It is problematic morally that we don't have an open door, but that's not, compelling to most people with their hard-nosed little portfolios. The real question for them is it useful? And I think the answer is, yeah, like the kids are missing out. They're missing out on something else that's harder to quantify, but equally important.
And it's not just useful, it's actually profitable. So,
well, that is useful for capitalism,
yeah.
isn't it?
Well,
Yeah.
so from a VC point of view, statistically speaking, I have a really poor track record in investing in white men. And they've always been the worst of my investments, worst performing, statistically speaking. And being clear, and it's just really, really interesting when you actually run the numbers. So for me personally, I seem to have a kinship and affinity with the ones that generally don't get mass traction and able to help and uplift them so that they can. Hence why I've chosen this very, very bad life choice financially. Venture capital is a terrible choice if you want to make money, by the way. Really, really, it's like pay as bad. If you make any money, it takes 10, 15 years for it to come through. Do not go into venture capital if you want to get rich, particularly to all those bankers who are going to probably ask me, how do I get a job in VC after this? Please don't. But yeah, it's that, sorry, I'm losing track of my point, but yeah, sorry, I've lost track of my point.
No, I lost a little bit of track as well. No, but it's okay. No, but I think it's really interesting what we're talking about. I think it really helps as we're going to the next topic, which is like talent redistribution. So when we're talking about, in a now globalized world, arguably we've come to the end of globalization, and that's something that's quite, that you hear a lot in the press recently as well. But I think it'd be really interesting to hear from, maybe Mandeep or Sarah, a little bit more about the opportunities that we have now that we are so hyper-connected, and how we can really view our teams and how we do build that community on a global basis. And really, like, is this ultimately like a really good thing that we're able to connect in this way, or are there hindrances maybe we could consider?
The answer is always yes and no,
Yeah.
right? Bit of both. But it seems like the opportunities are very global, and it seems like our teams are global in the sense that most of us are working in teams that span 30, 40 countries. They're all on some screen. You think you're being culturally appropriate, etc. But what are the real opportunities that are there? So, for example, if you look at executive assistants, just go to the Philippines for the EAs. Or if you look at, we still have that mentality, unfortunately, that certain countries will offer service, certain countries and cultures. And to your point about cultures are based on values. So certain communities and cultures are known for certain things. And so I think, being able to understand one another's differences, truly, like being able to value a person for what they really bring to the table, and being able to see that in them and being able to see their strengths, already builds a different culture and community and appreciation, rather than just, rather than not having that on the table. That sense of appreciation and building on strengths and values is huge. It transforms teams. And I think that's the difference between a team that has the word global on it because it's some tick box exercise, or because they think they're meeting some diversity quotient, vis-a-vis a team that actually works and values one another and builds like a trampoline that people can bounce on and really benefit from, and everyone's kind of reaching further, building on one another's strengths.
So I completely understand the notion of culture being partially values laden, but I think one of the most forgotten about coefficients is actually how we talk, the lingua franca that we build. So one of the challenges, as you were right, like there's a, EAs in the Philippines, etc. I mean, for some people, etc. But I think it's much more, one of the biggest challenges is when working globally across cultures, and particularly companies that do really, really well, have sort of a universal way of speaking and a universal way of codifying events, etc. Amazon, horrid company, but they have a very, very effective shared decision-making framework and shared language for doing so. And I think one of these things is that, like, the best companies, distributed or not, have this amazing sort of lingua franca that works so well. Like you look at the consulting firms, right? The countless books have been written about, the firm. And, I'm sure many of you have read The McKinsey Way. But I'm pretty sure that, and that's become the lingua franca of management consulting, right? The words, languages, the ways, the rule of three, all that kind of good stuff. So I think that's the other piece. And developing these lingua francas globally is actually a really interesting challenge. And I think we actually have a lot to learn from these large globally scaled organizations that have successfully scaled somewhat of a similar culture. Because that's the one thing you have to say, I have to admit, consulting firms, they do that. They've actually done that really well, the top three, the big three anyway. And so, yeah, that's my point. I do genuinely believe that's the biggest through reducing friction. I think with values, the problem is our backgrounds, our identity. I think there are some, but in the company I work at, we are distributed across we're technically globally remote, and I think we're in, 15 different countries. And inevitably, we bring our values and our cultures that we were brought with to the workplace. But our business is powerful because we have the diversity of thought, and I actually think the diversity of values to a certain degree as to what we think is right and what is there, and it helps us resonate with local markets. So I completely say it's there. It's just I think it's quite nuanced to me, and it's very, very varied. And I'm not trying to discount it. I'm just trying to say it's one of these things that I keep being say, startups come to me and they're like, yeah, what's our values as a startup? And I'm like, the whole thing is it's
worked with a lot of startups, so.
And they spend they do a 2-day thing, and in their pitch deck they'll have these 3 slides about values and 1 slide on profitability and unit economics. And it's just that balancing piece. It's a coefficient that's important, but there are others that get overlooked as a result of its over-prioritization.
I think you're saying the same thing, though, because if you're creating a lingua franca, you're creating a culture in an organization. And if you're looking at your values as a startup, you're creating a culture in an organization. So yes, we're all bringing our values and cultures from wherever we come from or whatever our worldview is, but then you are, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You normally hire people that have a certain set of values, and you're normally trying to create a particular type of culture in your organization.
Can I say something that's not quite either of these things? So in a way you asked, is this good or bad, this sense of shift? And of course the answer is sort of A, both, and secondly, it really depends on who you are. And I think something to highlight here is that, and maybe this is more relevant to everyone in the room, who are of course ultimately mostly employees and sometimes employers, the question is it good for which kinds of employees in particular? So what we tend to see is that the better skilled you are, the better you do in a workplace that is, let's say, highly mobile, often full of freelancers and self-employed people. If you are a white-collared sort of worker, especially if you have a specific set of skills that are slightly more in demand than others, you will probably do well in a market where you can effectively, if you're clever, bargain for a higher set of wages, etc. Right? And so we see that people who might have used to have dealt with lots of management for a long time and kind of gone on these really rigid tracks in developing in a particular organization suddenly can leave and become consultants or freelancers and point to their expertise and get more or less, especially in their own view, a better deal than they used to. We also see people who have very few skills who do quite badly, right? And this is a lot of, this is why the Amazon workers are truly suffering. They don't have lots of highly developed skill sets that they can use to bargain individually, so obviously they are finally turning to collective bargaining. But that's a long process. So I think a better question would be, who is it good for? And the answer, I think, is people who have skills. And not just the hard skills, not just the obvious guys in Silicon Valley with interesting coding skills or whatever, but also the skills of course, like managing cultural difference, speaking in a particular set of languages that the organization needs, and also what we teach at the School of Life, which are called soft skills, but increasingly seem important in a disconnected world, which is things like, can you listen to the other human being and realize what they're saying and say it back to them in a way where they feel heard? Right? It sounds incredibly basic, but if anyone has ever had a bad manager, you know just how hard this can be. So I think the answer is it's good for people with skills, and probably the challenge for all of us is that if we're employees, we have to manage our own skill development more than ever before. Because if you're not going to stay in an organization long, they might not want to invest in you that way. Hopefully they do, but not always. You might need to manage getting your own mentors, your own set of development processes in place, and also really knowing your limitations and not jumping too quickly into something you're not ready for. That's also hard. But it also means that as sort of a community, whatever that means, whatever community you're in, you want to think about how people can gain more skills so that they can actually get the benefits of this kind of workplace rather than merely the inconveniences and pitfalls.
Well, that also does advantage some people. So what's interesting is that often the people who start from, who've actually had a long track record of self-development or having to pull themselves up higher and further than others. So again, this is my obsession with like outliers and the overlooked. One of the characteristics they have and why they've actually instantly survived and resurged in this market has been their ability, because they started from a different place to other people to get to a higher point and where they're operating at the same point. They also tend to be more analytical of the environment that they're in.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess it's one of those things that this new world is very, very advantageous for those who've actually had more of a struggle earlier on, because there's more of an adaptability and malleability, and also identifying and seeking role models, or working out what role to mimic. And I think that's the thing, like in this whole freelance world, like half the reason, so being clear, I run a startup accelerator, right? Half the reason people come to join is because I'm a formerly successful founder. I had a few exits, few hundred million exit value kind of thing. I sound like an arse every time I talk about the money. But it's they're looking for role models, and it's actually really, really hard to find in that piece. And I think that in many ways, what I'm actually seeing is, and this is just anecdotally, certainly within tech and development and entrepreneurship and the whole gamut of skills in entrepreneurship, you go freelance for 2, 3, 4 years, but then you typically go back in-house because your ability to self-learn and self-develop cuts out. Or alternatively, you just get lonely.
Loneliness is a huge thing, actually.
And I couldn't agree more. And that, to me, is actually really like one of those things where, so one of the things particularly, sorry, I'm going on about myself and what I do. I just love myself. But the notion of particularly when working with founders, which is, anybody here's got a startup? 1, 2, 3. Do you ever find yourself feeling a bit lonely? Like all on your own and nobody bloody understands you? And particularly if you're a minority, do your parents question what the hell you're doing? Correct. Okay. And so this is what's really interesting. It's come to the point of community. Our careers, if we're going to build these careers where people are building stuff, you need your squad, right? Taylor Swift has her girl squad. My squad is not gender based. But you need your squad, you need your people around you. And I think that's what, so I think for me, one of the reasons I do what I do, which is build communities of entrepreneurs, we stick them in rooms together, but they all share and understand these values. And and in many ways, because they are essentially, and the reason I bring it up is they are essentially, typically 1 or 2 people businesses. They are not a million miles away from the freelancers, right? Just we've given them a bit more money. And it's that element of being around others and being at one with them and other people who understand you and get the whole, you're making very bad life choices being an entrepreneur. Statistically speaking, unless you're doing a high growth startup, there's very little point for anybody with a world-class education to be doing it, or a high income job that they're leaving. And you're betting on yourself and you're betting on market environments, and it's hard. And you need other people who understand you. And that sense of understandship and connection, that is, if you ask me what the biggest challenge for the next decade is, it's really understanding and connection. And as people, we build environments and build societies that allow that and allow careers. And I do genuinely believe the large corporations of the world will start seeing that, or the emergent generation of corporations, right? Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, they are all legacy large corporations. There's a whole new wave of corporations coming up underneath them, and they are going to eat their lunch on community.
to the point of disruption that we were talking about. Yeah.
No, I think, and Slim, you present a really good question, is what can we expect? You know, like, I mean, I think a lot of us would like to know too, like, you know, obviously this space is ever changing, and I don't know if the job market's gonna look the same in a year. I think a lot of things are very uncertain, right? So, but you make some good predictions, and I'm curious if you, you know, if either of you also have any idea of where this landscape's gonna change. Like, do we see autonomy or is it increasing in popularity, or are we finding that that autonomy comes with a sense of loneliness and that independence isn't really what we were looking for? It was just more that control.
Well, again, I mean, just to point out, I don't think that autonomy on its own is enough of a force, right? The reason people seek autonomy is because there's so little stability. If there's a trade-off between the two, and one of these seems impossible to get anyway, of course you will pursue the other one. So I guess my very basic prediction would be that unless there are really radical shifts in the economy, we'll continue to pursue autonomy because it seems like the rare thing that we can actually have. Not sort of because it's a, I don't know, drive like hunger or something that's completely innate. I do think loneliness will be a massive, massive result of that in many ways. I mean, I am a freelancer and I am lonely lots of the time, right? And especially when I have a question about something and there's just nobody who can tell me the answer. And maybe if I worked in a large organization, there would be somebody, you know, a step or two up, and I could say, how did you do this? And there's no one like that for me. So yeah, probably people will step in and essentially fill that market for that psychological need. But it's probably also a challenge to people who run organizations to try to think about how to facilitate that. And one thing that I'm very interested in as somebody who designs training programs for people is how there can also be more of a culture of that within workplaces, including ones that have freelancers. So it used to be that when you did training 10 years ago, you'd come in and say, like, here are all the managers for insert large tech company, and they're going to learn how to actively listen now, you know, and that would be interesting. But now we do a bit of that, and that can be important, especially for sort of the beginning point when someone starts being a manager. But I also increasingly am interested in this question of peer-to-peer learning, and I use peer very broadly. So it might still be somebody who has a higher pay grade than you or something, but the idea that people don't just want to learn from, you know, an expert at the School of Life. They want to learn from the guy that's already done the thing that they're about to try to do. And so we often end up facilitating learning from each other as much as teaching anything directly, which I also think is just nicer for people psychologically to return to autonomy. They feel like, I've chosen to learn from, you know, Salim because he's done this before. And it's a much more, I would say, self-driven form of learning. But it is one that companies can facilitate, and also that you can try to facilitate for yourself. So I see a trend towards that. I realize there's not like a brand name for that yet as an industry, but I suspect it will be quite effective.
Yeah, definitely. I think it goes hand in hand with the community aspect that we've been speaking about a lot as well.
Yeah.
Keeping those relationships.
I think it just circles back to where we began, which was that empathy, compassion, etc. If we're talking about community, it is all those values that you're wanting.
Yeah, definitely. So we are towards like the last half hour of the panel. I would love to give anybody in the audience an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have for our panelists. Yes, sir, raise your hand first.
And to introduce yourself, please.
Yes.
Hi, Rohit Talwar, futurist. Thank you for the panel conversation. I wonder whether we can create a more, or what the panel think about whether we can create a more inclusive, fair and sustainable opportunity for all across the planet just by talking about the opportunities for the kind of graduate audience in the West that we have here. You know, what can we do to take it beyond the kind of things you talk about? Because I don't think that if you talk about a lot of people who are on subsistence income, they're talking about their values, they're talking about teamwork, or they're talking about how best to work in a hierarchical organization. I don't think that even crosses their mind. So I just wonder how we extend what you're talking about to the 7 billion plus on the planet that aren't in this room or represented by the people in this room.
You're the futurist.
Yeah, but you're on the panel.
So it's a race. The reality is that you can't, we are talking about first world champagne problems in this room right now, 100%. and as someone who's worked extensively in emerging markets, one of the most interesting companies I had the privilege of working with is a company called Axie Infinity. Does anybody know who they are? Any crypto folk here know who they are? So they came into my accelerator at the seed stage. And so, some of you are looking at how much money have I made? A lot. And so Axie Infinity, basically, during the pandemic, it's a play-to-earn game. So basically, you play a video game, you build your character, you build your land, but each of the land characters you build, instead of going to the game studio to buy more upgrades, you actually sell them to other players, because they're all NFTs. So basically, it's a game you didn't realize it was super crypto. Well, you might have done. But basically, it was a way of trading goods and values across countries and cultures. And it was really interesting because the team was Vietnamese, Norwegian, and American Korean. And from the outset, they recognized that if they were going to build a game for the world, that the tokenomics of it all, a distributed nature, the fact that anybody can play and anybody can build and anybody can train, who cares where the person who's developing the character is from? And who cares where the person who's buying it? And so what's really interesting is that I actually genuinely believe that we're going to see more things like this, which create, not arbitrage, but create places that allow people in more emerging markets and environments to create things that are more valuable, that are more directly tradable. And I think that is actually the gift that Web3 and crypto will be, ultimately, which is actually should hopefully act as a social leveler. But what's interesting about these things, because they're inherently distributed, they allow the separation from a large entity. And by creating opportunities that allow that, I do think we can actually create a fair bit of global uplift. But that's just one example of one initiative in one way. It's barely the tip of the iceberg, but I share the story as it's one of hope.
Well, I think we're still talking about the global elite, even in that case. And I'm just going to talk about Ukraine for a moment, because there is a concrete example of a country that was not in the EU, but generally, in terms of all intents and purposes, looks like the rest of Europe and America. And so the way that the world responded to Ukraine, vis-a-vis East Timor, Myanmar right now, Syria, you can see that there's a world of difference. And I was speaking to the head of development, a minister for the head of USAID, but for Germany. And he said to me, "Oh, Mandeep, this is not really about race. This is really culture. This is really the fact that, when a Syrian comes or an Afghani comes to Germany, they don't, sometimes they set a fire in the kitchen. Like they haven't necessarily cooked in the same way, or they don't have the same norms for work, or they'll rise with the sun and they sleep with the sun, and they were shepherds before. And whereas the Ukrainians, there's much more of a cultural alignment. And already you can see what's happening, and you can see that this is the case very clearly. Like if you ask, we did a huge study across America. We asked Americans this year, how likely are you to house a Ukrainian or have a Ukrainian refugee vis-a-vis a Syrian? 80% would have a Ukrainian refugee, 30 to 20%, 26% would allow a Syrian. So it just speaks volumes, doesn't it? It's not like we still, even if we're talking about global teams or we're talking about these startups or we're talking about cryptocurrency, we're talking about tokenization, we're still dealing with the top 5% globally.
Axie Infinity's primary base is working class Filipinos. And so it's actually had a huge thing during the COVID pandemic where about 250,000 of them were actually able to earn their livings through playing this game. So I think they're playing this game and trading the assets that they create. And they're actually being able to trade the assets they create by playing the digital assets they create by playing this game. And it's actually able to earn their livings by doing
this
so.
Game is their salary.
They're creating digital assets. So by playing the game, they create digital assets and which are essentially tradable. And so, I think it's one of those things where we have to take a step back and say it's very easy to assume all technologies for the West.
I know, I'm not saying it's all for the West. I'm just saying that even if you're talking about NFTs and whatever we're discussing, there are, to your point about the 7.4 billion people we're discussing here, 4 billion don't have access.
Yeah, that's good. And also there are some interesting criticisms of crypto, which we don't have to get into on this panel, but it may not be the ultimate leveling mechanism for most people on planet Earth. And I think to return to somewhat more broadly and immediately applicable things, I think one of the important questions is power, right? I know that this is LSE, so people would rather talk about profit than power, but an important point is whether whatever technologies we create and also whatever movements we are in together, who has control over them. If something is run by a couple of people at the top who have high shares in it, it is probably less likely to benefit the people below. Not always. I don't want to say that's true of every startup. But I think a really important question will be whether the many widely distributed freelancers of the world decide that they want to work on collective projects that make the people that you're concerned about, to go back to the question asker, that bring those people in or leave them out, right? It's a very good question to ask about any movement or any technology you want to get interested in.
Thank you all. Do we have another question? Yes,
Hello, my name is Georgie. I'm also LSE alumni. My question is a bit, well, it's directly related about the careers, maybe not so much about the diversity. So most of us know that like HR people are the worst people you can ever meet. Everyone hates HR. And at the same time, right now, it's getting amplified by the HR tech, where we're using the greatest machine learning and AI to improve, to optimize the process of hiring. And like many people here who've been in the application process know this is kind of the game. You look at the job application, you're trying to fit your CV, you're trying to fit your cover letter to match it, and then you win the game when the match is happening. The problem that I've personally encountered with this is that once you actually change your CV to fit the job application better, yes, you do get the interview and then it goes beyond. But the problem is that you're getting less and less of yourself, and that is, speaking of the not diversity in the greater sense in terms of diversity of the cultures, diversity of the individuals, we actually try to minimize it, because like every individual applying for the position actually cuts down his uniqueness, trying to be more matching. Isn't there like more institutional problem in this?
Can I first say something annoying?
I didn't mean to offend.
Not at all. You haven't offended me at all. I think HR people are also quite difficult because I have to work with them as clients. So, but I love to come talk to me afterward, HR people. No, but I think the first thing to say before we go into this sort of like nitty-gritty analysis of how we can make hiring less of a terrible nightmare for everybody involved, especially the employers, is I do think it's worth just taking one step back, just as a person who does too much philosophy reading, and point out that at the end of the day, if we're looking for our employers to understand us to the same degree as our friends and our lovers, we're probably looking in the wrong place, right? That I think we live in a world that absolutely glorifies work to death and thinks it's like the purpose of our life, and like, what do you want to be as an adult? And what we mean by that when we ask a child that is like, what are you gonna do for money, right? And then they grow up, and if they don't have a job that they think is impressive enough, they feel ashamed, and like nobody wants to talk to them at the party, and so on. And fine, I understand. I too live in London, and I have for 8 years, but it may be that our jobs are probably never going to understand us that well. I mean, we run classes for human beings at the School of Life, and they come to us and they say, my job isn't meaningful enough, and I want to make jobs more meaningful for people. That's why I wrote this white paper, why I try to train people to be less terrible to one another at work and all this. I want that, but I also think before we go into that, we have to be realistic that work is not a replacement for love, it's not a replacement for friendship, and it's really hard to be understood, even in love and friendship. So we're going to have to be like a tiny bit skeptical before we get to work. And I think that to go right to that, like the reason that we have these horrible algorithms, or whatever, that tread through the hundreds of CVs is that realistically the first thing an employer is looking for better or worse, and sometimes they shouldn't be, like I'm sure at Techstars they should also be looking for all kinds of other things like cultural fit and the person's actual personality, especially because
we don't actually use resumes, and there's
perfect.
So.
Yeah, so they've gone beyond this, but many companies haven't, and a lot of the reason is, firstly, if you're not running a small culturally sensitive startup, a lot of the time you're looking for someone who can do a task quickly, efficiently, right? So it makes sense that that's what the algorithms are looking for. And I think we would have to see a really big shift in what most jobs are before we could think about it differently. And I guess all I'm saying is I'm saying this so that people who are going to have to go through this process for the next 10 years because they're 23 or even 31.
You even have to do it when you're edging your 40s.
Yeah, it's horrible. Like, I'm sorry that you have to go through this process, and I hope we can improve it, but I also think it's important to look for this sense of being understood and finding meaning and value in your life other places, because eventually we die, and in the meantime we should do things other than work. Yeah.
So I mean that comes down to I love Jeff Bezos has the whole regret minimization framework,
Yeah.
which I love on that piece. But so I'm one of those people who's like so I spent a few years building software in this space and marketplace and trying to understand. And to be blunt, the HR people I think you've got unrealistic expectations. Why the hell should a HR person try to understand you? That's not what they're there to do, right? The HR person is basically, rightly or wrongly, in the organization constructions that we have today, are simply a filtering point for function. And so if you're using software, et cetera, to determine function, probably not the wisest thing in the world, but one of the challenges they have, and let's just look at it from their view. One of the things I think is interesting is we thankfully aren't America, right? America is predominantly a network-based hiring economy, right? The culture of the informal interview, right? The culture of HR application processes are edge case for most of the people they'll hire, right? Thankfully in this country, that is kind of there to a certain degree, but it's much lower. And so in many ways, and it means it's more open and there's more of a pool. And so there's a trade-off to be had, right? And even the large companies, even the big large companies which claim to be super, open about their applications, they still do a lot of what I call in-network nepotistic hiring. It's why in America, why is an Ivy League education so valuable, right? It's the network.
I promise it's not for the classes. I got one. It was the network.
And whereas I'd argue in the UK, I'm like, where's my bloody network? Like, where is it? I don't have one. I have like 6 friends from my undergrad, and that's it. Hated everybody else. But then again, that's that institution. But moving swiftly on. But that's the whole thing. It's like you are asking a question that I think is like, in fairness, now the managers, when you go for an interview, right, the base level has to be, what can I do? Does this company need what I can do? But then the rest of you, that's really about culture and fit with the managers, and we don't really have, again, to this point, unless you're a company with a clear lingua franca, it's very hard to determine up front. And even when you are, how many of you who've been applied to consulting have read case study books, how to crack the case and how to get that? You're trying to adopt that lingua franca. And that's what's interesting. People want the goal often more than to be themselves. Very true for LSE grads, by and large, in their first job out of college, right? And so, it's just, actually, it's interesting. I feel like it takes 4 or 5 years to be out of college and out of the pressure cooker environment and out of the social infrastructure that says, you should be doing these, and these things, to actually finally find your own voice and sense of self. And for many people, it takes much, much longer. Some of you are super enlightened and you're able to do it straight out. God bless your privilege and your lack of desire to conform. And lack of desire and need to be that. But yeah, I'm very jealous of you.
Yeah. Well, in terms of finding your own voice and getting a sense of like who you really are, that does come, like I have a tool that gets you there, and it doesn't take, it doesn't have to take a painful 5 years, 10 years out of college. It's about really understanding what motivates you, what makes you tick. And there are companies and organizations and startups, etc., who will speak exactly that language or speak from those values. And so to identify your top 5 values, it can take as little as 15 to 20 minutes. And then you, again, it's that self-fulfilling prophecy, you gravitate towards the organizations that speak the same language, and it doesn't have to be painful. And then, yes, when you're being hired, you will feel understood because they're already speaking the language that you believe in, and that is important to you. So I don't think you're naive, and I don't think you're asking for too much. I think it's just about knowing yourself first and then gravitating towards those. And sometimes, of course, it takes time. I think if you're not aware of this, of what's important to you and your values, it can take trial and error, and then it's painful. But actually, there's a shortcut.
No, very well said. I totally agree. Do we have any other questions? Yes, right here.
And the people at the back, just wave, because I've been trying to ask.
I might just be blind.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
exactly.
Yeah.
We're just going to make sure we come there and do the people at the back.
Yeah, firstly, thank you so much for the insights. It was really, really interesting. We talked a lot about the need for culture, connection, understanding, and these are the skills which are really in demand. And in an interesting study, it said that a third of skills on job applications won't be needed in 5 years. So how do we know, as fresh grads, recently grads, how do we know what skills we should be developing now to put ourselves up well for the future?
Great question. Firstly, I think we live in uncertainty, so nobody predicted COVID. I don't think there's a golden standard, perfect, definite way to know, right? That said, I do think that emotional, psychological, interpersonal skills are probably not going to get old unless the robots get really good, really fast. Probably those will be useful in 5 years. I think self-management in particular, which is a very broad term for a wide range of skills that live beneath that umbrella, is increasingly important because I actually think we are getting fewer and fewer skilled managers and fewer organizational structures where those managers can actually pick people, develop them for several years, etc. So by self-management, I mean, can seek out new tasks and suggest that you do them, can figure out what the next step is and then learn how to do that, can report up. Managing up is a huge skill. And I think it's a really important one to learn in the first 10 years of your job. By that, I mean making your boss's job easier, including managing yourself and telling them, I thought this was good, so I did this. What are the next 3 things you'd like me to learn how to do, right? I think those things are not going to get old. I think there's an interesting tech question that I wouldn't pretend to get into about which technical skills are going to be useful in the next couple of years, but I would focus on that. And I have to say, in my own career, I've done a wide range of technical things. And some of those skills I've left behind. I used to write YouTube scripts. Now I don't really write YouTube scripts anymore. Lately, people actually want you to do super bite-sized learning with really face-to-face, different shaped on your phone videos and whatever. Okay, those are all technical skills and they pass you by, but these skills tend to be relatively evergreen. And then I agree that we're also probably going to see more and more cross-cultural stuff. And so I think learning how to ask polite questions in lots of different cultural tones, including the McKinsey tone or whatever, is also probably going to be useful in 5 years. Other thoughts?
I was just going to say that it's true that we don't even know what the jobs look like in 5 to 10 years. So not to the more resilience, the more critical thinking, the more kind of open and curious and always learning you are, the better foundation you'll have. And the less we think about our I think almost the less we think we need to have skills and competencies and waiting for a job where you've got 70 to 90% of those competencies, but rather think, actually, I'm a learner, if I have an open mindset and I'm going to be able to do this, and I'll learn from the people around me and make sure it gets done, is a much greater competency than having the kind of hard skills, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that's the point too, startups and founders and teams, is the fact that you invest in a founder, you invest in a team, not necessarily this kind of concrete skill set as it is today. You're investing in almost, their personality, their values, their grit, etc.
And it's adding to that, it's actually the route, the pathway they came through to learn their right to play and how they develop the awareness of that market. It's that piece of people who've had a harder struggle to get to where they are have paid more attention to the details along the way. And so that's probably one of the things. It's learning to pay attention to the details along the way, because the future is almost always at the intersection of 2 disjointed things with an alternative way of looking at the view. So classic example will be healthcare, right? Really boring, but nowadays most of us do our appointments with the doctors over our phone. But 10 years ago, when I was looking at companies looking at early health tech companies, the idea of a medical appointment with a digitally distributed overlay, facilitated by 5G internet, 4G internet, right? And so, it's that idea, it's the intersection of multiple disciplines. So the real secret, I think, is to actually we very much the world tells us to be one discipline. The academic institutions basically try to be a one discipline, right? The best financiers are also lawyers. The best lawyers are also computer programmers, right? It's the idea of you can no longer be so I'm a psychologist and a computer scientist, right? Shock horror, bloody useful the intersection of the two is where I create value, not on either point. But there are actually three things everybody should learn. One, it's regular expressions in SQL. Do you get me? How much of your life is easier and saved because you can just do very quick dirty data analysis? Okay? I'm not joking. Best thing to learn. Go learn it now. There are free classes online. There must be a class here at LSE on this stuff, but it saves you so much time because you can filter data. And managing data is not going to go away in the next decade or two, right?
I agree with this, and I don't have this skill. But I've worked at a lot of startups, and it always is useful.
There's that.
And also big companies. Yeah.
Two, the other skill that you can actually learn is how to interview. How do you interview somebody else to get them to do? So, we have a journalist on the team, we have somebody whose job it is to teach this stuff. Learning how to interview and learning how to ask questions, get the answers you want when people don't want to say them. The delta between what we say and what we mean, two completely different things, right? Total, utter life skill that everybody should have, right? My little segue in my journalistic career taught me wonders on this.
We can give a little workshop at the end.
Very happy to, actually. I cannot emphasize how happy that is. And lastly, the technical skill that everybody needs to do, that everybody thinks they don't need to learn. It sounds stupid, but I feel awful saying this. Can you read a balance sheet? Now, so many people can't. Most venture capitalists can't. I'm not joking. Many of them can't. Like, you think that, and many of them can't actually genuinely read a balance sheet for what it actually is, what it means, and what it says. Take the time to learn it, because you will have to manage your own wealth at some point, right? Particularly this group, right? This doesn't apply to everybody, but at some point, either you pay some nitwit who, barely, has a fancy degree, doesn't really know what they're doing, or you could do yourself as a nitwit who's got a fancy degree who doesn't know what they're doing, right? And so that's the other life skill I would have, because one of the things I think is going to be much more important now is not just self-managed, but like understanding how we manage our own financial autonomy, understanding how we put our money and allocate, is actually a skill that should be taught in schools early on, right? And half this room, I can guarantee you, if I was to say, right, how do you make a decision as to whether to buy Apple stock today or not? Most of you probably hold Apple stock, right? But how did you make that decision? Mostly on a whim, right? And it's that thinking broadly into everything else that you do, not just that, but then applies everywhere. So yeah, 3 hard skills.
Amazing. So we only have several minutes left. I think we have time for one, potentially two, probably one more question. So
That gentleman who's been
yes,
waiting.
you have been waving, so it's your turn.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm currently an undergraduate student, and I'm currently here on exchange. And I just have I think it could be a really simple or hard question to answer, but if you can look back into your life to around my age right now, which is, I'm not going to say I'm really young, but like I'm at 20 right now, like what are some of the advices that you would give yourself? Because we're under a lot of stress right now with the current economic conditions that we're in. And the future at least for me, it seems really, it gives me anxiety at night. That's what I'm going to say. So I was wanting to say, like, do you have any advice for like people of our age, or like for just people who are entering the workforce right now, or who might be their own bosses in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to say a little one that I was given and I didn't really understand when it was told to me. My first boss, or the first company I was hired by, was JP Morgan. And I remember the woman who hired me, she hired me for this program called Women in the City, telling me that it would be great that all these glass ceilings would break and it would be really easy to be a corporate woman in the city. It wasn't quite the way it worked out, but she gave me a book that was really helpful. It was called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And at the time, I'm like, all you're doing is sweating the small stuff. You're like, what is this? I didn't quite get it. But the more that now, looking back, I can tell you what she was teaching me was perspective. And that sense of, like, I can understand the stress you're feeling. I can understand, if you think too deeply about any of the stuff that we're facing, it does freak you out, and it's better not to think about it. But what you're trying to do here is to give yourself a sense of kind of, sometimes they have this technique for people who feel overwhelmed, which is to sit on the floor and look up at the sky. And you have that sense of perspective that a star does, you know, like zoom right out, zoom so far out that you get a sense of not just what am I thinking, what am I doing, what was the point of me being so obsessed by whatever. Helps when you can see the sky, so not in a room. Even better in, you know, after 6 o'clock when the sun's gone down, or 4 o'clock, or 3, you know, the nights are very long here at the moment. But that sense of perspective, like, you know how you feel when you get out of this pressure cooker and you're on, you know, you're on holiday where you can actually see the horizon, or you can actually see the ocean, or whatever, that type of perspective. It just grounds you and calms you. And it's really important to bring that into your everyday, and not to allow the small deadline or whatever, all of it. But think about something you were stressing about last year. You probably, one, can't even remember it, and two, it wasn't worth it. So that would be my...
Great, yeah, perspective is good. I think
it's a value.
Yeah, and it's a value, yeah. I think in addition to all of the practical stuff I said about learning the psychological skills of work and the interpersonal skills, which will be useful no matter what happens, I would just say, look for less of a sense of control. And I think this is true at every possible level of like work. I don't mean
control is a myth.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think this is true even if, you know, you hold the VC capital, or you just walked in the door as the intern or whatever. I went through like a really, really boring, fancy education, and they made it sound like what a career is that you sign up for something and you study really hard and you like win and you beat the other people, and then you have this job and it automatically leads to that job and it leads to that job. And I don't know exactly what the other panelists had experiences of, but I didn't do that. I went to San Francisco to pursue some guy that wasn't that interested in me, and while I was there, I applied for some weird jobs on the career forum, and this one job was so weird. The person said, like, I need you to write an essay about Theodor Adorno, the grumpy communist left-wing intellectual from Germany. So I did. And believe it or not, that was the first basis for the YouTube script at the School of Life on Theodor Adorno. We have a YouTube on him. But I didn't know that at the time, right? And it turned out that what my boss was doing is he had 20 different people writing these essays, and then he took 10 of them back to write a second essay, and then 5 of them, and then whatever. And okay, eventually I got this weird job, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I will tell you the truth right now, I have no idea what I'm doing now either. I just show up for work, right? And I have lots of different clients, and they're all doing weird different things. And I made up my job title and I stuck it on my LinkedIn, and I said, I am a content strategist and learning designer because I have done projects involving content strategy and learning design, and you should hire me. And people did. And I've done a very good job with my clients. But I've done it mainly by just knowing that I'm not in control. Right? That I'm not in control of what my clients will need next year, or what they needed last year, what my boss needed for years and years, or what's going to happen to the economy. I don't want to go on and on, but I think, like, don't look for the trad career if you don't want it, and don't trust it to be there. Instead, just keep looking for the next weird thing, even if it's an essay about a communist guy, and and just keep surfing it, right? And keep looking for the next thing, because that is all there is basically until you retire or they put you in the ground.
So that's definitely, I think that's great if that works for you. I think there's another thing for people who are a little more risk averse and
Sure.
don't feel as, like, so being blunt, when I left university, I wanted the badges of honor of working for a big consulting firm, large things, because it helped me feel more secure. Fundamentally, my family's not rich. I don't have much of a background to fall on. And I generally don't feel like the world is automatically going to go, hey, Salim, you're exactly the kind of person we're looking for. And that's sadly what most of my life is reinforced. But so therefore, like, if you do go in, I'm actually a great believer that working within a large environment where you have other people who can mentor you, help you, and structure you is actually super, super helpful in the long run. I think one of the things that I always say to everybody, and like even when I look at startup applicants, I very rarely look at the ones who've just come straight out of college, because there is something so valuable about entering the world of work and being a bit beaten down by it. Mm-hmm. Because it's just the harsh reality of the operational environment, and we've come, particularly from the privileged universities, we have this sense of identity. Great, everything's going to be wonderful, and it just isn't. And so there's that side. Secondly, I'm going to go being blunt. A recession is a bloody great time to be a fresh graduate. Why? Really good question.
Because you're cheap.
Fundamentally.
You're cheap and they need cheap workers.
Yeah. And also being clear, like everybody's in a world of risk aversion, cost helps.
Yeah.
The other side of the coin is that people are more likely to try new things during a recession rather than go through. Like anybody who's, so I've been clear, I have been through a couple of recessionary cycles, right? Dinosaur, small arms, remember? And the joy of that has been like, you've just seen what people have gone through, and it is magnificent. Your ability to rise, your ability to learn, the projects you'll get exposure to. You may not earn more money, but to be blunt, your 20s should be for learning, your 30s should be for forming, and your 40s should be for earning, right? That's how I look at it. Right? Probably explains why I haven't really, I don't know, I may have got that timeline wrong myself. But that would be the advice I would say. Keep your 20s for learning and don't be afraid. And yes, you will have to do all sorts of weird things to understand different environments. But the main thing is, can you put yourself around other people who you admire or who have done things where you want to be and see if you want to be like that? Can you learn from their role modeling and get yourself into those positions? But yes, as we were saying, you're cheap. You're willing, and as long as you show the determination and you show that you're a safe pair of hands, that's the number one thing you need to be.
Yeah.
Not brilliant, but a safe pair of hands. To don't sweat the small stuff, 100%. And it's just doing what's required. Be safe first in the workplace. Spend your first year being a safe pair of hands, then try and build your outer ambitions. There's nothing more annoying than somebody who's been 9 months in and starts asking for promotions, really.
And the point about role models is that you would only know the kind of role models you really want to be around if you think do a little bit of soul searching beforehand about who it is that you consider admirable, right? There's no point putting yourself in an organization where you're like, wait a minute, I actually don't want to be like any of these douchebags anyway.
It's very
waste
true.
of time.
Can I just say I agree with you about the bit with the large companies as well? And I went through a large company for a while. In fact, that's what happened with this YouTube thing, right? Then I joined a large company for 4 years. And that was really important for me because it meant that I had to get managed by other people, which I absolutely hated and I learned so much from, right? So I'm not saying wander into the world and demand your dues up front. I'm just saying know that you're not in control and that no amount of organizational stuff can give you control and that it's uncertain. It's an uncertain process, so don't panic about that. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for your contributions. I think we should give a round of applause for our panel.
I have a cheeky question to ask. While you were all there, we took a little sneaky picture, but it'll be much nicer to take one with you if we can do a little selfie like this.
Oh, that would be really nice. Yeah, if you want to be
Right?
part of the picture,
Sure.
please come forward and we can do that.
Or just stay where you are and just
Do you want
smile.
to? Shall I?
Whatever.
Okay, great.
Oh, you want to do one like take the picture
Yeah,
here and then
all of
okay, great.
Ken, you should be.
Excellent.
Amazing.
Wait a second. Ken and Elise. Come.
I'm
Hello.
really short, so I just stay where I am.
Yeah. Wait, Ken. We can't see you. Step in. Right. Yay. Thank you.
Okay.